This is DBrief, brought to you by the Australian Industry Group.
Welcome back to DBrief, the podcast where we explain policy to industry and industry to policymakers. I'm Louise McGrath, Head of Industry Development and Policy at the Australian Industry Group, and today I'm joined by Simon Dowding, Head of Strategic Communications and Government Relations at the Pact Group. While there's been growing concern and interest in the use of recycled and recyclable plastic packaging, the recent supply chain shocks caused by the Iran war and a parliamentary inquiry into extended producer responsibility, or EPR, has accelerated the conversation. So it's great to have Simon here to get that industry voice. Simon, for listeners who don't know Pact, can you give us the elevator pitch? Where does Pact fit in Australia's plastics value chain? And roughly what scale are we talking about?
Yeah, thanks, Louise, and nice to join you here. So Pact is a plastic packaging manufacturing and recycling company with operations throughout Australia, New Zealand and in Asia. In general, we make plastic packaging for food, drinks and household products that you find in your fridge, your pantry, under your sink, in your bathroom, your laundry, your shed. Now, we're talking everything from milk bottles, yogurt containers, ice cream tubs, through to agrochemical bottles, shampoo bottles, laundry bottles, you name it. We probably make it if it's in your household. We also operate a number of plastic recycling facilities in Australia and New Zealand that recycle used plastic packaging from household recycling bins and container deposit schemes. And we also do a little bit of industrial packaging waste. So we then use that recycled resin to make new bottles and containers for food, beverages, household products and industrial products.
Now, Australia is a net importer of plastic packaging. So what does that structural position mean day to day for businesses like Pact? And how much of your strategy is now shaped by that import dependence?
Yeah, okay. So for plastic packaging, so in the past 12 months, Pact produced around 190,000 tonnes of plastic packaging and other products. But only 16% of that was made using recycled plastic. So now that's not because the technology doesn't necessarily exist. It's mainly because there's no mandatory requirements to use recycled plastic in your packaging. And so the market demand for those recycled materials is just not strong enough. Now, that's, there's plenty of progressive brand owners who are choosing more sustainable packaging, and we make it for them, but not as much and not as many as there could be. Because when you consider that 1.3 million tonnes of plastic packaging is placed on the market every year, only 20% of it's recovered for recycling, and only 10% of that is actually made with recycled materials. So the reality is that most of the packaging that we as Pact make for our customers uses imported virgin resin.
Yeah. And really, we should be thinking of it as a resource.
Absolutely.
To utilise. Yeah. Now, before we get into the details of EPR and recycling, we can't move past the situation with Iran, as I said in the opening comments. So a couple of months ago, I think, when we spoke with a number in the food industry, it was pretty much a month-by-month proposition. But I think you mentioned the other day that it's starting to ease, even though prices are high. So has something changed, and how fragile is the current situation?
Yeah, well, I can only speak on behalf of Pact Group here. But yes, as you know, things have escalated in the Middle East again. And it does have the potential to cause further disruptions. However, what we learnt over the course of the first part of the conflict is that we had to really do things a little bit differently. So as a consequence, we built up our inventory levels, and at the moment our stock levels are fairly strong. And we're pretty confident that we have a decent enough buffer against any short-term logistical disruptions at least. And we think we've got, plenty of supply, plenty of inventory to carry us forward for the next 3, 4, 5 months. So from our perspective, we're not too bad. That said, we still have to scramble and purchase on the spot market to take us further forward. But interestingly, most of our suppliers from that region have established alternative overland pathways to get material outside of the Strait of Hormuz. So they're going to ports outside of the Persian Gulf. And they're already operational, and we don't see any disruption to those sources as a result of the escalation in conflict at the moment. And further to that, a lot of our key resin suppliers, which are based in places like Southeast Asia, have reduced their reliance on Middle Eastern feedstock to make their resins. So, and they're sourcing their naphtha and other materials from other countries. And I think prior to the conflict anyway, as a result of an experience, I guess, that we learnt through COVID, we felt it was prudent to diversify our resin suppliers anyway. And so we have been sourcing a lot more from countries like the United States. So that's in terms of sourcing our supplies, I think we're as well placed as we can be at the moment. In terms of pricing, it's certainly still higher than pre-war levels, and it is volatile. So just in the last few days, we've seen PET spot prices jumping by almost US $70 to $80. So, and we think other resins will also increase. Now, that has just been going on since this conflict began.
Yeah. Well, I mean, regular listeners will know there were a couple of months ago at the beginning of the conflict, Jeff and I sort of reported on all the sort of cries for help from various members in all different product categories. And I think the fact that the average consumer has no idea that all this scrambling's been going on is really testimony to companies like Pact and others, working on relationships, working on shoring up supply chains, as you say, learning the lessons from COVID. And, people often talk down our supply chain, say, oh, are they resilient? I think they've proven to be remarkably resilient, really, given how all the force majeure letters and things that people were flying about. I think it's made a huge difference, all this hustling.
No, absolutely. And credit to our supply chain team.
Yeah. Now, if we get into the recycling side, your position paper argues that embedding 20 to 30% of Australian-made recycled resin would improve packaging supply from globally exposed to structurally resilient. What's a realistic pathway to get there? Is it with CapEx, with offtake, feedstock, or policy?
Look, we would say policy. I think that's the key to it. There has been a lot of investment in recycling facilities and upgrading facilities, not just in plastics but other materials as well. But in terms of plastics, and I would say in some of the other materials as well, I'll speak to plastics. If you move towards a mix that incorporates, say, 20 to 30% recycled content, businesses, and by businesses I mean, our customers, so your brand owners, your producers, you can insulate a portion of your supply from these global shocks. So it can reduce your reliance on imported materials because you're manufacturing it here, and effectively reduces your exposure to disruption by a third. So that's simplistically that position. But I think what we're seeing is that many companies are just reluctant to shift towards that approach, primarily because, as we all know, manufacturing in Australia is more expensive. So the only way we're going to be able to do that across the board is by policy. We had national packaging targets set back in 2018, I think it was, to achieve by 2025. Now, there was some movement towards there, but not enough, primarily because those targets were voluntary. So back in 2022, when it became clear that Australia was not going to achieve those targets, the state, territory and federal environment ministers sat around a table at the environment ministers meeting and agreed that a reform of packaging regulations was needed so that all packaging could be was designed to be recoverable, recyclable and made with recycled content. and made into new packaging. So 4 years on, we're still not there.
And I mean, it's a very complicated area and a very heated area. A lot of strong opinions. Post-consumer recycled content can sometimes be caught up in the same squeeze as virgin resin, with some manufacturers warning of labelling and claims risks. People talk about greenwashing. How is Pact managing that credibility gap between what's on the label and what's in the bottle?
So it comes down to traceability. So if we have 3 very large scale recycling plants in Australia, and Australian-made recycled resin provides, for our customers that we use in our packaging, provides quality and traceability advantages for not only the manufacturers, but for the brand owners that want to incorporate recycled content in their packaging. So you can trace it all the way through. So if I give an example, for 2 of our facilities recycle beverage bottles from container deposit schemes. And last year we recycled probably 3/4 of all the bottles that were collected through schemes across Australia. Now, we can obviously we take them in, we process them, turn it into recycled content, recycled resin, and then that's sent to the beverage manufacturers who are joint venture partners in these recycling plants, and they make new bottles out of them. So you can trace where that's come from, because it's not mixed with anything else. It's purely bottles that are sold on the Australian market that are then processed here. Now, we're also, one of those plants is now also taking in some material coming from the South Pacific. But again, it's collected over there. We can source it. We know where it's come from. It's cleared biosecurity issues. It's washed before it gets here. So we can trace all that material. And similarly with our material, it's recycled out of curbside bins that's used to make, whether it's household packaging, so, your shampoo, laundry bottles and things like that. We know where it's come from. We know what it is. So you can trace it. We've also gone through processes using international certification systems. So it's actually certified that what we say it is. Now, that's not the case if you're importing material from other countries necessarily. So you don't know how that material's necessarily been collected. It's probably been recycled using the same types of equipment and in a similar facility and a similar process, but it may not necessarily, as I said, you don't know exactly where it's come from. It may not have the same independent third-party certification that we've gone through. So, and in some instances, it might not even be recycled content. Now, you don't know, but I think by using Australian-made recycled content, you do have that assurance. Plus, you also have that resilience that you've got that surety of supply. You don't have the extra lead times. So there's a lot of benefits in using Australian-made recycled content beyond just the traceability piece.
Yeah. Now, food contact packaging, particularly dairy, I don't know why dairy is so particularly loud, but they've had some of the toughest testing traceability requirements. What are the real bottlenecks for that? Is it the technology, the standards, or is it consumer acceptance, both of just the product, but also the price?
Yeah, look, I think I'll start a little bit broader if I can, because using recycled plastic resins to manufacture packaging for food and beverages, dairy products, personal care and home products, agricultural chemicals, and industrial products is commonplace globally. So when you look at the different types of polymers that are used, so PET is considered the easiest and most recyclable plastic globally. So that's what you use for your beverage bottles per se. But it's also used for juices, water, milk products, meat trays, produce punnets, bakery items. and they can all be made with up to 100% recycled PET. So, and that's commonplace globally. I think you'd probably find, if you paid attention to a carbonated soft drink bottle, many of them have made with recycled plastic, and in fact, some of them will have made with 100% recycled plastic. So similarly, things like fruit and vegetable punnets and meat trays, they can all also be made with up to 100%. In the dairy sector, we do actually make recycled bottles for some flavoured milk and iced coffees. So with PET, it's very commonplace. The dairy industry, for your white milk products, your standard, milk that you bring home. Now that most of that is made with HDPE, so high density polyethylene. That too is also very easy to recycle, and it's commonly used for food and non-food grade packaging. And it's typically used to hold heavier liquids, like milk, but other liquids as well, because it's a bit more resilient and it doesn't crack or leak. So now, in Australia and New Zealand, there are some dairy products and milk products which are currently made with at least 20% recycled HDPE, but you don't necessarily hear about it too much. There are very strict requirements and food safety requirements that you have to comply with for food and beverages and milks. Our plants have been gone through a lot of testing. So the resin goes through a lot of testing internationally in laboratories, and it is compliant with US FDA food standards. So now, though, food standards are one thing, but they also are testing that you need to do for structural integrity, colour, and so on. So we've been doing a lot of that with the domestic dairy industry. We've done it with some of the dairy companies in New Zealand. It's also very commonplace, not that we operate over there, but commonplace in the UK and the EU. As I mentioned before, yes, domestically made recycled resin is more expensive. That's a simple fact of life. We have to pay more here for electricity, for labour, freight, all sorts of things. So it is more expensive, but I think for us that heightens the case for the need for extended producer responsibility. But I just do want to point out that the cost of packaging, if we look at milk in particular, if we take a 2-litre bottle, which I think is around $3.55 or so, let's just call it that, the cost of the bottle itself, the packaging, is around 20 cents. So that's to use virgin plastic, virgin HDPE plastic. If we were to make that same bottle with 20% recycled HDPE plastic, that cost would be around 20.5 to 21 cents. So we're not talking a lot.
Yeah.
I do understand that milk is a high volume, low margin product. And I think I'm old enough to remember the milk wars. And so I do understand the pressures that that price plays on the cost of milk. But in the scheme of things, it's a very, very the packaging itself is a tiny cost.
Yeah. Well, very nice segue into EPR, Simon. So we might have a break now and they'll come back and get into it.
No problem.
You're listening to the DBrief podcast, brought to you by Australian Industry Group. To find out more about how Australian Industry Group can help your business, visit australianindustry.com.au.
And welcome back to DBrief. I'm speaking with Simon Dowding, Head of Strategic Communications and Government Relations at Pact Group. And we're getting into the detail of Extended Producer Responsibility, EPR. So, Simon, much of the public EPR debate, including a lot of, even your commentary, has focused on food and beverage packaging. But reform would actually cover the whole system, wouldn't it? Household chemicals, toiletries, anti-tamper collars and caps, blister packs, other pharma applications, really every material stream. And each would have different technical constraints. Is the industry and perhaps our policymakers being honest enough about the complexity of the situation?
Yeah, okay. So extended producer responsibility effectively shifts the cost and accountability for packaging waste from councils, taxpayers, consumers to the companies that place the packaging on the market in the first place. So now we would contend, and I think a lot of the industry would contend that EPR must apply to all packaging placed on the Australian market, whether it's produced domestically or imported. So just making sure that it's all packaging. But I think one of the pieces that we have to factor in is, as you said, that while EPR does need to apply to all packaging and all material types, I think we and I think policymakers understand that there are products which have very specific requirements that may place, technical or structural constraints on the material that's used for that packaging. So, for example, it may be pharmaceuticals that have specific TGA requirements that they just cannot, change the nature of their packaging. Or it may be dangerous chemicals that may prevent the use of recycled material, for example, or a different type of material. And similarly, there may be instances where the contents of a particular packaging, so it might be, say, I don't know, there might be a hazardous chemical or some oil, means that it can't be recycled with other materials. So in those instances, I think you would think that the regulations would provide exemptions until there is a way to use more sustainable options for that packaging, or there is some way of dealing with it after it's been used. So I think you would hope that there would be sensibility there, and the signals that we get from government is that would absolutely be the case. I don't think you could just have a blanket regulation without some form of flexibility and exemption.
Yeah, and I guess it'd need to be twofold. So not just what happens with the waste, but some design rules. You can design products to use less plastics, etc.
No, absolutely. And I think that's the way that the extended producer responsibility works, is that it all starts with design of the packaging. And I think, as I said earlier, you have to design the packaging so that is made with the most sustainable materials, if you like, and it is made to be recycled, recoverable, remade into something else, where it's technically feasible to do so, and where it is dependent on what the product is, that you can actually use that packaging.
Yeah. Now we're getting into another acronym. There's acronym heavy, but currently a lot of packaging is governed by the voluntary APCO approach, which is the Australian Packaging Covenant, which Australian Industry Group is also a member of. Given it was voluntary, a lot of people might argue that it's failed. I think we also agree that there needs to be some sort of mandatory regulation. But if it's in a mandatory environment, how would we stage things to support SMEs, to bring along the entire industry?
I don't think it's just SMEs. I think what you need to look at is what capability and capacity currently exists in Australia. So it just wouldn't be feasible to say this has to apply to everything from day one. I think you'd need to look at what the experience is overseas to understand what is being done elsewhere, which can then be implemented here. So if I look at plastics, for example, and I think this is sort of an example, but polypropylene is a widely used plastics in the food industry because it's got a high melting point and can also be frozen without cracking. So it's used for things like ice cream, yogurts, but ready meals because it's microwavable, and also it's used for quite a few sort of bottle caps, so for beverages. But it's also used in sort of for other applications as well because of those properties. So, but the thing about polypropylene, it's also quite absorbent. So while it can be, and it is recycled, it's not suitable to be recycled into food grade resin with the current technology. So recycled polypropylene is often used for secondary products like crates and pallets rather than new packaging. So while it is recycled for our industry, we'd suggest that it's downcycled. It's not a circuit. It's good, but it's not exactly what you'd want. So as a result, you might end up, it's not a high value plastic to be recycled, if that makes sense. However, there are advanced mechanical and chemical recycling technologies which are being developed and have been developed. They can now process polypropylene into food grade resin, so you can then have that circularity. And that's starting to happen in the US and the UK. And I think I read recently that the US FDA has graded food recycled polypropylene as compliant with its requirements. So in time, you'd expect that to be available here in Australia as well, but that would require significant investment and new facilities and what have you. So I guess what I'm saying is that from implementation date of an extended producer responsibility scheme, you would have to phase in and factor in what is currently available here and what can we do now, and then what do we need to aim to do. But I think just because it can't be done now or because we don't have capacity or capability doesn't mean that that's not going to happen in the future. Now, if you're looking at smaller, you mentioned the SMEs, we all understand that it will take time to adjust to this. So for recycled plastic resins, for example, and to manufacture products with recycled plastic resin, it's not just a matter of swapping a bag over and saying we're going to put 20% recycled resin. You have to have new equipment, and you have to have the ability to have blending equipment. So there is some upgrading manufacturing facilities that you do need, which may cost money, but you also need to factor in that it will take time because you then need to do testing to make sure that the products that you're manufacturing for your customers meet all their requirements. They have to pass a number of, for example, food safety, if it's food products, structural integrity, colour, and so forth. So there is a bit of time that you do need to adjust. So we would say that if the government was to pass regulations, by the end of this year, which optimistically we hope, but we would not see that necessarily implemented for another 12, 18, 24 months. So I think we would be fairly bullish about it, but I understand that others may not be in a position to do that just yet. So how that's factored in, I don't know. Whether it's if you're a small manufacturer, maybe there's a little bit of extra leeway there.
Yeah. But you make a good point about polypropylene. And, in this conversation, we generally just say plastics or packaging. But Australian Industry Group's own position is that recycled content targets should actually be material specific and staged. And I'm saying this, I finished chemistry in year 11. So I was saying this as an arts graduate. So, but, in the case of polymers, PET, HDPE, LDPE, and polypropylene or PP are simply not the same problem. And then you get to fibre, glass, metals. How do you think it's possible that we have these targets that are polymer specific, or does it have to be a blanket one when we get started?
No, we'd agree with different thresholds by material type. So, and then within plastics by polymer type. So, and that's the experience certainly in the EU, where they've set targets by polymer. So, and while we did have those voluntary APCO targets, and there were some high level targets for everything. Once you drilled down into it, there were different targets for different polymers for plastics. So, as I mentioned, I think you could be realistic about PET. It's easy to recycle. You can use it for up to 100% recycled plastic for certain products. But, I think that would be unrealistic as an initial target. So I think, for example, PET, you could start off with 30%, HDPE maybe 20%, and so on. So I don't think you could have a blanket recycled threshold target or threshold, but I think you do need to have different targets for different material types, but they're not static. They need to increase over time, and that's what the EU has done to encourage. It will improve as more facilities come online, as more testing is done, and as the technology improves. So it's certainly easy to do.
Yeah, and I guess as volume increases, the business cases are made, technology improves, research improves, and so, yeah, it's all much more achievable. So in May, I attended a roundtable with three ministers. We had Minister Watt from Environment, Mr. Ayres from Industry, and Minister Collins from Agriculture. And it was a roundtable primarily in response to the supply chain shock from Iran, but it was to look at plastics, recycling, how could we improve targets? And there were all sorts of voices from industry, and obviously I was there representing Australian Industry Group. I was very hopeful. Three ministers, cabinet ministers spending 90 minutes on one topic is pretty rare. We haven't heard anything just yet, but from where you sit on your conversations, do you think something's shifted since that roundtable?
It's a conversation I have with a lot of my colleagues and others in industry groups and so on. So you can take a glass half full or a glass half empty approach, I think, at the moment. From our perspective, the roundtable was a positive, particularly in the fact that Minister Ayres, the industry minister, had the opportunity to understand the importance of packaging reform and the benefits to domestic manufacturing and sovereign capability, as well as the pitfalls if we do nothing. So I think that's just as important. So I think that was really positive. We do hear a lot from Minister Watt and from his office that the department is doing a lot of work behind the scenes, and we are engaged with the department on various issues in this regard. But on the flip side, we've heard nothing since, and we're now, as I said earlier, almost 4 years on from where state and federal environment ministers agreed to progress with packaging reform. So, look, it's been moving at a glacial pace, and that's very, very disappointing. In terms of what the blocker is, I don't know. I think it's just that the government doesn't see this as a priority. I think there's not that kind of, I suppose, public outcry about our packaging. But I think what people need to understand is that it has touch points everywhere. I mean, for people who live in New South Wales, there's, quite frequent references to the fact that Sydney's running out of landfill. So, one way to alleviate some of the pressure on landfill is to use that material, that waste, which I think you correctly called a resource earlier, to use that to recycle it and make new packaging. And you can divert a lot of material away from that landfill. I think most consumers, there's been a lot of research. I think Cleanaway did something recently, but there's often opinion polls about consumers saying they want more sustainable packaging. Well, more sustainable packaging is made with recycled plastics and other materials. So I think the other, there's plenty of other research that shows the CSIRO did some research that for every, you create 3 jobs by sending, I think it is 10,000 tonnes of material to landfill, but you actually create 9 jobs if you recycle it. So there's plenty of benefits. It can reduce emissions. It can give us better sovereign capability. It can grow. It can create jobs. So there's a lot of reasons that you should do it. I think we've seen in Europe and other countries as well, in other regions, that recycling facilities are closing because of that lack of demand. So hence, a lot of those countries, particularly in the EU, are moving down the path of EPR.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to finish. Slightly optimistic. I think you're right, Simon. It is a resource. It will improve our sovereign capability. But, it is quite a complex area. We've got a lot of voices within our membership, and Molly Knox in my team who works on it will be engaging with all of them. But thank you very much for your time today, Simon.
Thank you for having me.
And if you've found this podcast via a link on LinkedIn or on our website, you can always subscribe on your standard LinkedIn, podcast capture. And if you have any questions or suggestions for us, please do email us at industry.policy@australianindustrygroup.com.au. And thank you very much.